Hey, Pastor Dave here. Let's talk about gospel predominance in preaching. Now, the theme for this comes from a man named C.F.W. Walther, 19th century German Lutheran theologian, in his book Law of Gospel. Excellent resource. Encourage you to buy it yourself from Concordia Publishing House. Now, he states in the book, let us now turn to the Holy Scriptures and convince ourselves that in general the gospel must predominate. And he's talking about within sermons. Well, this is going to be a series. Today's topic, I'm going to talk about two errors as it relates to the proclamation of the gospel. The first one is more so a Lutheran error, not that all Lutherans do it, but I've seen this particularly in Lutheran churches, and that's preaching the gospel, the good news of salvation in Jesus Christ, but doing so at the expense of whatever text the sermon is based upon. Well, I'm going to talk about that more in another video. So, what's the other error? The other error I've particularly noticed in Baptist churches and in non-denominational churches. It doesn't mean it happens in every one of those churches, no. But where I've seen that error has been particularly among them. And this is when the gospel, if it is preached at all in a sermon, is preached at the end of it for the gospel call, for the salvation of the lost, but not for the encouragement of the saved. I remember having a conversation, a brief one, with a fairly well-known Baptist minister, great guy, and I brought this topic up about preaching the gospel to the saved, and he had mentioned that he hears that from his Presbyterian friends, but he didn't understand it, preaching the gospel to the saved, because the saved don't need the gospel, in other words, because the gospel is for the lost, that they become saved. Well, that's really an inadequate understanding of the gospel and the application of the gospel. Why must the gospel be preached also to those who are already Christians? Let me give you 4 reasons. The first reason is that the saints sin as well. Romans 3:23, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. That includes Christians, and they continue to sin, and so they need the application of God's grace in Jesus Christ. They need to hear the gospel for their own sins. A second reason is this. In Romans 1:16-17, we're told that the gospel is the power of God to salvation. Now, since that is true, it also means that the gospel is the power of God then to keep us in our salvation. And so, on that basis, Christians need to hear the wonderful preaching of the gospel of grace in sermons every Sunday. Here's a third reason. We see the example of the gospel being shared among believers, for instance, and commands to do so in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 9 and following, where Paul commands that the Thessalonians share with each other this mutual encouragement that at the coming of Christ, they're going to see the fullness of their salvation and they're not going to be enduring wrath. That is gospel. That is an application of the gospel to one another, and that is explicitly what Paul commands in 1 Thessalonians. And the final reason, I'm sure you guys could come up with more, but the final reason I'm going to give is from 1 John chapter 2, verses 1-2, where John proclaims the advocacy of Jesus Christ for his disciples, for his sheep. Even now, Jesus being our advocate in heaven for believers. So that John is applying the gospel to the believers and wants the believers to apply the gospel to each other. So, 2 errors in application of the gospel. One, mostly a Lutheran error, where we preach the gospel at the expense of the text. We'll talk about that later. And one I've seen mostly among the Baptist and non-denominational brethren, that is preaching of the gospel, but only to the lost at the end of a sermon, and many times not even in a sermon at all. Well, y'all have a wonderful day, and remember that Jesus does indeed love you.